Okay, so we are ready to start? Yeah, that's good. Good evening, everyone, and welcome all to MyWow first webinar. MyWow is the acronym for Migrant Women and Opportunities for Work. My name is Sandra Ruiz Moriana. I'm the project coordinator for this initiative, but I'm also going to be chairing the panel tonight. We appreciate you joining us today and take the time to be here with us. But before we move to the panel, let me let you know a little bit more about MyWow. MyWow is the newest project of New Community Partnership. New Community Partnership, NCP, is an NGO based in Dublin and is working and striving for the rights of migrant people and their families living in Ireland. MyWow, as part of the services that New Community Partnership is providing, and also the projects that they are running, we have MyWow. MyWow is funded by the Department of Justice and Equality, Ireland's European Structural and Investment Fund programs, and also the European Social Fund. Thank you to all of them. We can be here today. And thank you to all of you as well. So MyWow is looking to explore, support, and overcome specific barriers that migrant women like myself are facing in Ireland during their job-seeking journey. MyWow is designed to empower migrant women to reach their potential, rebuild their confidence, and upgrading their skills. We want to facilitate their access to the labor market and or career progression in ways that they are linked to their professional goals. And this is really important because we want to support women in any area of the labor market at any level. Additionally, MyWow is also working with the other side of the coin, and we also aim to provide support and a critical thinking space to enterprise and anyone involved in the hiring process to create and develop an inclusive and equal routes for migrant women to participate in any space of the Irish labor market. If you want to know a bit more about this training, please get in touch with us. Also, as part of the service that we are providing, we are now recruiting migrant women who aim to return into the workforce. If you are interested in participating or if you want to know a bit more, again, please get in contact with us. So you can email us to mywow@newcommunities.ie, so MIWOW@newcommunities.ie. We're going to leave now the email in the chat box. This is all about MyWow. And if you want to learn a bit more, you can always go to the NCP website or you can get in contact with us. Before we move on to the panel, then I know you are really excited about that. Let's do go through some housekeeping rules. As you can see here at the bottom, we have the Q&A chat box. The panel are going to be talking for approximately 45 minutes, and then we're going to have plenty of time for your questions. So please, if you have any questions, you can leave there in the Q&A chat box. And we have our Diego, our administrator, that is just behind the scene, collecting and compiling all your questions and selecting the one that we are going to be debating. Unfortunately, we cannot answer all your questions, but if you want to get in contact with us, please do so. Also, let you know that after the presentation between today and tomorrow, we are going to be sharing you a follow-up email with more details about MyWow and also a survey. And if you don't mind to answer this survey about the webinar today. Finally, to let you know that we are actually doing a live stream in NCP Facebook. So if you know somebody that for any reason didn't register on time or is coming late, let you know that they can actually follow up this webinar in the NCP website. And we are recording, so hopefully we'll be able to share the full video in the future day, in the next few days. That's all for me. So I think we are ready to move to the panel. This is our first webinar. We are running a series of 4 different webinars in the next few months, and this is the first one. So today, the webinar, we're going to be talking about the labor rights of migrant women living in Ireland, and we are also going to be touching on the possible impact of COVID-19. I'm delighted to welcome and be joined by our three amazing speakers, Lalini Verisamy from the International Organization for Migration in Ireland. You cannot see her now because we need to keep two people at the same time just because we have the interpreters, but she will come up later. Mehak Dugal from Forza Trade Union, and Natasha Soto, the project officer of MyWell. So that's all from me. I'm gonna stop talking now, I promise, and I'm gonna pass on to Natasha Soto. Natasha is the project officer of MyWell. She is also my partner in crime of this project, so we are working very close together to develop this project. She has over 6 years of experience working in the community and charity sector in Ireland, Spain, and Venezuela in the areas of international development, education, social justice, and community integration. Natasha is a Venezuela law graduate and holds a master's in law in international human rights, law from Griffith College, Dublin. She's passionate about human rights, I can tell you this, social justice and inclusion, women empowerment, and community development. Please welcome, I know we cannot clap their hands, but please send your best energy to Natasha Soto. Natasha, you are very welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Sandra, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Sandra said, my name is Natasha Soto, and I'm going to be talking to you about the labor rights and obligations of migrant women in Ireland. Before I start, I ask you to please bring your attention to the slide on the screen. I think Sandra will be sharing her screen now. It is a short legal disclaimer to clarify that the information we're providing here today is for information purposes only, as NCP is not a practicing law center, and this information is not intended and should not be considered to be legal advice. However, if you do need legal advice in relation to your employment rights in Ireland, please contact us and we will refer you to the relevant organization service provider to review your specific case. There it is now. Thank you, Sandra. I will be covering 3 topics today, namely, what are your working rights in Ireland? What are your obligations or your duties as a worker in Ireland? And what can you do if you think that your rights are being infringed? I must mention that employment law is a wide and range, large area of Irish law. So today I'm only going to be covering an overview of the basic rights and obligations that you have as a migrant worker in Ireland. And we'll be sharing via email an information guide with more details on your employment rights, as well as the slides I'm going to be sharing with you today. So don't worry if you think that you miss anything, because we're going to be sharing after the webinar the information guide and all the slides. Now, what are your rights as a worker in Ireland? Well, as an employee in Ireland, you are entitled to receive certain basic employment rights. Even if you're a migrant worker, you have the same rights and protections in work as Irish nationals have. Some of examples of the general rights you have are, you have a right to receive written terms of employment or a contract of employment. You have a right to being paid at least the full minimum wage rate in Ireland. You have a right to not being expected to work more than 48 hours per week, or 40 hours if you are under the age of 18. You have a right to receive pay slips. You have a right to receive annual leave, public holidays, maternity leave, or adopted leave. And you have a right to equality and non-discrimination. I'm also going to be covering your rights during the COVID-19 pandemic, as I know it's very important at the moment. Now, contract of employment. Anyone who works for an employer for a regular wage or for a salary automatically has a right to a contract of employment in Ireland. Your contract of employment can be in writing or it can be agreed verbally. But the statements of the terms of employment of the contract must be issued to you in writing within a 2-month period of your starting your work. And this document should specify your place of work, your job title or the nature of the work you're going to be doing, the start date of your employment, your salary, your working hours, the breaks you are entitled to, your paid leave, your sick pay if there's any, your period of notice, and the duration of the employment if you have a temporary job. Not all of your contract terms may be in written statement of your terms and conditions of employment. Some of them may be in your staff handbook, maybe in a pension scheme booklet, or in a collective agreement. You must ask your employer for this because they are important and it is your right to have them. Generally speaking, changes in your contract of employment after it has been signed are not allowed without the consent of both parties. So, however, there are some changes in legislation that may cause changes to your contract of employment, and both you and your employer have to comply with the law. However, any other changes must have to be agreed between you and your employer. And please always, always, always read your contract of employment thoroughly before signing it. And if you're in doubt about a specific provision of your contract, or if you think there might be some sort of mistake within the contract, raise this concern with your employer and have it amended before signing the contract. Now, your right to a minimum wage. Generally speaking, the amount of pay you receive for working is a matter of agreement between you and your employer. And these negotiations normally occur when you receive an offer for a job. However, there is legislation in Ireland that provides that if you are an employee and you are over the age of 20, you are entitled to the full rate national minimum wage, irrespective of the industry you work in. Although there are a few exceptions on this, and you can find this on the information guide we'll be sending, the minimum wage applies to all full-time workers, part-time workers, temporary workers, and casual employees. Since February 2020, the national minimum wage for an adult worker in Ireland is €10.10 per hour. If you're not receiving your minimum national wage, you can enforce your right to this minimum wage with the Workplace Relations Commission. But I will be talking about the Workplace Relations Commissions later on. Now, your working hours. According to Irish legislation, for most employees, the maximum average working week cannot exceed 48 hours. This doesn't mean that your working week can never exceed 48 hours. It is the average that is important. And the maximum working week of 48 hours is average over a period of 4, 6, or 12 months, depending on the industry you work in. Your employer has to keep a record on how many hours you work, and you have a right to a daily rest break of 11 consecutive hours. You also have a right to a weekly rest break of 24 consecutive hours, and you have a right to rest breaks while you are at work for at least 30 minutes during the day if your working day is longer than 6 hours. If by any chance you are required to work more than 48 hours per week on a long-term basis, or if any of the other rights are being breached, you are entitled to file a complaint with the Workplace Relations Commission. Now, I mentioned that you also have a right to a pay slip. A pay slip is essentially a written statement from your employer that outlines your income. And it outlines the total salary payment before taxes and deductions are made, and also the taxes and deductions that they are taking. And every employer in Ireland has a right to a payslip. In the screen, you can see a sample of how a payslip looks like. However, I will not go into detail about the meaning of each part of the payslip. But in the information guide we will be circulating after the webinar, there is an explanation of each part of the payslip and the meaning of each code. And it's important for you to have this information and to understand what each section means. Now, their public holidays. All full-time employees are entitled to 9 public holidays each year. However, part-time employees, to be able to qualify for a pay or a paid day off on a public holiday, must have worked at least 40 hours in total during the 5 previous weeks, ending on the day before the public holiday. If you have to work on a public holiday, you are entitled to one of the following in exchange, as decided between you and your employer. Either a payday off on the public holiday, or a payday off within a month of the public holiday, an extra day's annual leave, or an extra day's pay. And if you work part-time and the public holiday falls within a day that you do not normally work, you are entitled to 1/5 of your normal weekly wage for that day. In relation to annual leave and your right to annual leave, your entitlement to annual leave or holidays from work is set out in legislation, but it's also set out in your contract of employment. What Irish legislation provides is for a basic annual paid leave entitlement of 4 weeks. But your contract of employment could give you greater rights. However, it could never give you less rights. This is set out in legislation. Part-time employees' right to annual leave is calculated by a method used, the third method, which is basically the 8% of your total hours worked. In terms of your sick leave or your entitlement to sick leave, in general, you have no right to be paid while you're on sick leave from work. However, employers can decide their own policy on sick leave and may decide to pay you while you are off sick. Your employer must give you a written information about their sick pay policy, either within your employment contract or in your staff handbook. If you cannot get work because you're sick or you're injured, but you have made enough PRSI contributions, you can apply to the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection for a payment called illness benefit. But now, if your contractor or your employer includes sick pay policy, then you don't have to apply for this benefit. What happens between annual leave and sick leave? Well, if you're ill while you're on annual leave, you should get a medical certificate from your family doctor or your GP as soon as possible, because this way, the sick days will not count as annual leave and you will be able to use them at a later date. Your employer cannot require you to take annual leave if you have a certification for a period of illness. Now let's move on to maternity leave. All women in Ireland are entitled to 26 weeks of maternity leave from work if you become pregnant whilst in employment. Your contract of employment should state if your employer will pay you when you are on maternity leave, but this is not a requirement of them. However, you may be entitled to maternity benefits, which is issued by the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. The maternity benefit will only be paid to you if you have made sufficient PRSI contributions or social insurance contributions to be eligible. There's a special right connected to the right to maternity leave, and is that you also have a right to return to work after maternity leave. So you have the right to return to work to the same job with the same contract of employment. However, if this would be too difficult for your employer to arrange by any given reason, then they must provide you with suitable alternative work. And the terms of this new job must not be less favorable than those of your previous job. Now, similarly to maternity leave, we have adoptive leave. And all women in Ireland who are adoptive mothers have a right to adoptive leave from employment. Adoptive leave gives you 24 weeks of work to a woman who's adopting a child, and the 24 weeks start from the day the child is placed in your care. Your employer doesn't have to pay you for adoptive leave unless it is stated in your contract. However, if you have made enough PRSI contributions, you can get adoptive leave from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. And this payment is available to both employees and self-employed people. And similarly to maternity leave, as an adoptive mother, you also have the right to return to work following adoptive leave. So you have the right to return to the same job with the same contract of employment. And if by any reason this could be too difficult for your employer to arrange, then they must provide you with suitable alternative work. And the terms of this new job must be not less favorable than those of your previous job. Now, as a migrant woman, you also have a right to equality and non-discrimination. Irish employment law prohibits discrimination on 9 different grounds, and they are gender, which also includes gender reassignment, civil status or marital status, family status, sexual sexual orientation, religion or belief, age, disability, race, which also includes color, nationality, ethnicity, or your national origins, and membership of the traveler community. Legislation in Ireland prohibits discrimination in employment, and in particular, prohibits discrimination to access of employment, conditions of employment, training or experience for or in relation to employment, and promotion or regrading of classification of posts. It is not legal for your employer to discriminate against you because you're not an Irish national. Now, the right to equality also has a right to equal pay, or has a connection to the right to equal pay. And according to Irish legislation, a woman is entitled to be treated not less favorably than a man in the same employment, where she is employed on like work with a man. In simpler terms, what this means is that if a man and a woman are doing the same job, they should be paid the same. And in the term like work, what does it mean? It basically means that the work that one employee is doing in the same organization as another employee is the same. So if 2 employees are doing the same job, and one is a man and one is a woman, that shouldn't matter, and they should be paid the same. Now, your rights during COVID-19. In general terms, your rights as an employee are still the same during the pandemic. However, different circumstances may give rise to specific employment rights or protections and maybe benefits during this time. But this depends on whether your employer has no work for you or has less work than usual, if you are sick or you have been asked to self-isolate, if you have to care for someone else, or if you're pregnant. If your employer has no work for you or has less work than usual, there could be 2 scenarios. The first scenario is that your employer may have closed their business during COVID-19 and has sent you home. This is called temporary layoff. Your employer can use the temporary COVID-19 wage subsidy scheme to keep supporting up to 85% of your weekly take-home pay. And this means that during the temporary layoff, you remain an employee, and there is no need for you to personally submit a job seeker's claim. However, if your employer cannot pay you and you have lost all of your employment because of the pandemic, you can apply for what is called the COVID pandemic unemployment payment. The second scenario is that your employer can also put you on short-time working, which is a more formal procedure and applies to you when, due to a reduction in the amount of work, your weekly pay is less than half your normal weekly pay, or your hours of work are reduced to less than half your normal weekly working hours. In this scenario, you have to apply for a short-time work support, and this is a benefit from the job seekers benefit. How is annual leave and public holidays affected during layoffs or short-time working? Basically, you're still employed by your employer, and your contract of employment remains the same. So this means that you're entitled to benefit for any public holidays that occur during the first 13 weeks of your layoff. And however, you do not have a right to accrue new annual leave during the layoff, but you are entitled to take annual leave that you accrued before being laid off. Now, if you are sick or you have been asked to self-isolate, if you're showing symptoms of COVID-19, you should not go to work. Please do not go to work. You should contact your GP for advice. And while you're sick with coronavirus, or while you're sick and you have been asked to self-isolate, you may be entitled to sick pay from your employer. But this only depends on whether that is established on your contract of employment or not. If your employer does not pay you sick pay, you should apply for COVID-19 enhanced illness benefits from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. If you're not sick, but you cannot go to work because you have to take for a child or another relative, you can ask for paid leave or for statutory leave. For paid leave, your employer has a few options. Your employer can offer you to paid compassionate leave. They can offer you to, or allow you to work from home. They can alter your shifts so that you can coordinate with someone else to take care of your relative. They can allow you to rearrange holidays, and they can allow you to take paid time off that you can work at a later time. Those are some options that your employer has. However, if they can't give you paid leave, you can apply for statutory leave. What does statutory leave mean? It's leave that is set out in law. And some examples of these are force majeure leave, which is paid leave, parental leave, you would need to apply for supplementary welfare allowance, and parents leave, and you would need to apply for parents benefit. Now, in the case of you being pregnant, if you are pregnant and your employer has no work available, you should apply for COVID-19 pandemic unemployment payment. And this applies for both when your due date is within 16 weeks and if it's more than 16 weeks from the last day of your employment. You should submit your maternity benefit application as normal. Your maternity leave should start no later than 2 weeks before the end of the week in which your baby is due. If you're still getting the COVID-19 pandemic unemployment payment when you're due to have your maternity leave, you must close this claim and then claim maternity leave benefit as normal. Now, you have rights as a migrant worker in Ireland, but you also have obligations or duties. In contracts of employment, there are what is referred to as implied terms. And implied terms are conditions that are read into a contract of employment and applied to you and to your employer, even if they're not expressly written down in your contract of employment. I have listed 3 implied duties that you should all be familiar with. The first one is the duty of obedience, attendance, and competence. The second is the duty of due diligence and care. And the third one is the duty of fidelity or good faith. The duty of obedience, attendance, and competence. It means that you must obey and follow your employer's orders that fall within the terms of employment as set out under your contract of employment. However, you are in no way obliged to comply with unreasonable or illegal orders. You also have a duty to attend work on time and work the hours contracted. And you must perform the work you were contracted for competently. And this means that you must be reasonably competent to do your job. Incompetence can be considered to be a breach of contract. Now, your other duty is a duty of due diligence and care. And this means that you must exercise reasonably care and skill in the performance of your duties, and you must take care of your employer's property. You can be considered to be in breach of this duty if you perform your duties negligently. And finally, you have a duty of fidelity or good faith. And this means that you must act honestly and faithfully, putting your employer's interests first and avoiding any conflicts of interest. You must not take any secret profits, commissions, or bribes from the relationship with your employer. And you must maintain any confidential information from your employer's trade secrets or other information. Now, what can you do if you think your rights are being infringed? Well, if you feel your employment rights are being violated, there are a number of things you should do. If possible, the first step you should do is bring the complaint to your employer or to your line manager directly. However, if you can't talk to your employer or if the situation isn't being fixed, you will have to make an official complaint. For most workplace complaints, especially those related to the rights I set out at the beginning of the presentation, you can fill in an online form at the Workplace Relations Commission's website. However, if your complaint is related to a health and safety issue, you should contact the Health and Safety Authority through their website. If your complaint is about the non-payment of taxes, you should contact the Revenue Service directly. And if your employer hasn't been paying your PRSI contributions, you should inform the Social Welfare Inspectorate of the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. You have to make sure to carefully read the requirements of each body before you send in your complaint. If by any chance you're feeling overwhelmed or you feel like you need some extra help in making your complaint, there are some things that you can do. You can, for example, talk to FLAC. FLAC is the Free Legal Advice Center. It's an independent and voluntary organization that promotes equal access to justice for everybody in Ireland. And they offer free and confidential legal information and advice to the public. Although their main office is in Dublin, they have legal advice clinics throughout Ireland. And currently, because of the pandemic, they're also offering legal advice via the phone. And there are also some different migrant organizations working with the employment rights of migrant workers. And if you contact NCP, we'll be happy to refer you to some of them. But I would say as well that it could be a good idea to talk to a trade union representative if your workplace has one. If they don't have one, you can try to get in touch with a trade union representative from a trade union branch in your local area to see if they can be of assistance. However, as our next panelist is a representative of a trade union, I would leave it to her to explain you what a trade union is and what the benefits could be of joining one. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for a very informative session. So just to remind to everyone that you have any question for our speakers, remember to leave use the chat box to leave your questions there. So now we are moving to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mehak Tugal, is the communication assistant of our Forza Trade Union, a political science graduate from Trinity, currently working as a communication assistant at Forza Trade Union. Her research interests focus on human rights violations of minority migrants with an aim to improve their representation and visibility in the political sphere. Mehak, you are very welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mehak Tugal, and I currently work as a communications assistant with Forza Trade Union. And I'm really happy to be speaking at this webinar today because there is such a need to have not only the involvement of migrant women in the Irish labour force, but also their empowerment. As someone who was interested in politics and wanted to get involved in policy making, I did the most obvious thing I could think of and went and studied a degree for it. And I thought, that's great, that's done. And then I graduated and started job hunting. And that's when I had my own experience of applying for jobs as a migrant woman. I had the qualifications, but it seemed like there weren't many opportunities or accessibility to the job market. So while compiling my notes and researching for this talk, I came across this piece of research that said that by the ESRI, that said that non-Irish nationals were 3 times more likely to report having experienced discrimination while looking for work than Irish nationals, even after controlling for the differences in gender, age, and education, which just goes to show that you could have all the qualifications and tick all of the boxes in the job requirement, the job advertised, but you could still most likely face discrimination. So starting off, I just wanted to talk about some of the issues that migrant women face when it comes to their work and what a union usually does in addressing those issues and the help that they offer. And instead of focusing on a wide range of issues in union activities, I mostly chose the ones that I felt were most relevant to migrant women and what officials hear most of the time from migrant women in Ireland. So firstly, I'm going to be talking about discrimination. In normal cases, when you talk about discrimination, it'd be about incidents of racism or sexism at work. But a lot of the times it begins way before your first day on the job. There's a lot of discrimination in accessing the employment itself. And it seems to begin the minute you send in your job application and you sign off with a different name. if you're applying for a job and you haven't been shortlisted or called in to interview despite having the skills and the experience that's advertised, you can absolutely ask for a reason. Why not? And a failure to provide a genuine reason of why you weren't suited, despite having all the requirements, it is a possible case of discrimination. And that's often ignored. You know, you don't think too much about it. You move on to your next application, but you should absolutely question that. And that's just one of the things that we could do to, you know, help bring about a systemic change. The next thing is the lack of opportunities. Many migrant women leave behind careers in their home countries, because of, and when they get here, because of a lack of opportunities and accessibility, they end up working in lower paid and exploitative jobs in Ireland. And many women are highly qualified and they have the skills required, but they just don't get the chance to use those skills. It almost seems like the problems faced by migrant women are amplified by the fact that they are both women and migrants. As it stands, migrant women workers are predominantly in the lower skilled and the lower paid areas of the labor market, which is not to say that it isn't increasing now. We are making up a growing share of the skilled market, but the concentration is still quite in the lower paid sectors of the labor market that are, you know, poorly regulated, and they're often not unionized. Which could refer to the large number in healthcare and hotels and the domestic services. Which brings me to my next point of poor working conditions. And that doesn't only refer to the unsuitable work times and the long hours like Natasha previously mentioned. It also refers to the breach of employment legislation by the employers, paying below the minimum wage and sometimes not even providing a contract even. And the reason this happens in the case of migrant women is one of the biggest problems, that is the issue of job dependency. In a lot of cases, these employers are in charge of the sponsorships or for the temporary visa holders. And the women feel like they don't have a voice and they can't voice their complaints about these precarious work conditions, which just makes it that much more important to have union protections in a place like that. So at the very least, you get the ordinary workplace protections that you are entitled to. And legally, you have every right to join a union and no employer can discriminate against you for that. So union negotiations just help you ensure that you are entitled to above the minimum standards as set by the Irish labour law. And the last issue I wanted to speak on was career progression, which is an issue that union officers are frequently contacted about all the time. There are many barriers to progressing your career as a migrant woman, and a lot of organizations are a party to this, where they don't encourage the women in the organization to apply for the higher level jobs. You know, getting in is just the first step, and once you do that, you go through all of the interviews and everything just to only to then get the job and then expect to remain at that same level of job for years. So that complacent attitude that the companies and management often have is what acts as another barrier for so many women. And that's another place where a trade union's role is recognized. It's having someone come in with that objective opinion, an unbiased third party that assesses your situation and provides advice about the next steps to take. Because to be honest, more often than not, you are qualified to progress further in your career. It's just having someone tell you that you are qualified, you are skilled, and you have the experience required, and advise you for the next steps that you need to take. So next, I just wanted to talk about some of the general benefits of joining a union, starting off with better pay. It's been proven that workers who are trade union members earn more than the non-unionized workers, and that's because of the use of that collective bargaining voice to fight for better salaries, health insurance, sick pay, overtime pay. And it's the union's duty to negotiate with the management to get the best for the employees and union members, so you don't have to do that. The next thing is better work conditions, specifically with regards to the health and safety conditions, but also parental leave. On the health and safety front, unionized workspaces tend to be much safer because the workers are not expected to work in places that don't comply with the standards and regulations. And with the backing of a union, you can feel confident in saying no to dangerous work conditions without having that fear of losing your job. And on the topic of parental leave and childcare, it is such an important issue that we are constantly seeking better arrangements for, and it greatly affects migrant women more than others, I'd say, because when you go to a new country, a new community, and in a new workplace, what happens is that many migrant women don't have that family network and that level of support to help them with childcare. So provision of that and better arrangements for childcare is something that is constantly in the works at all levels of the union. So when it comes to the next point, that's training and development, all unions often provide support and advice and resources to help with your career. And that starts right from interview training, and also assisting you if you have maybe a job evaluation coming up, and even training programs for people that are interested in becoming union representatives at their own workplace. And the last thing, of course, is general advice and support. And I'd like, this isn't always with regards to, extreme issues. It doesn't always have to be a case that has to be taken to the Workplace Relations Commission or made into a dispute. It even refers to, matters of bringing up sensitive issues with the management. If you have concerns, how do you approach the management? How do you structure and voice your concerns? And assistance with all of that is also provided. Like I've written down there, a union is not only going to tell you your rights, it's going to defend your rights for you as well, because there's little point in having all of these statutes and legal rights if you can't enforce them and use them. So on just the last slide here, I've got some links for anyone who's interested in learning more about unions in general or their activities, or in joining one even. The easiest thing that I always recommend is going to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions website. That's ICTU right there on the first point. And what their page ICTU Connect does is you put in your information about the type of work you do, the level you're at, and they put you in touch with a union and recommend a union that's best suited for your profession. And basically that just saves up on you having to do all of the research work yourself. The next one there is the Health and Safety Authority, which just has a ton of resources to deal with maybe stress or bullying or any other workplace issues that you can think of. It has great resources to help with all of that. And also, of course, a ton of guidelines and standards to be maintained in the workplace. That could be with relation to safety when it comes to accidents in the workplace. It could also mean the behavioral code of conduct that needs to be maintained. So the HSA has a ton of, an extensive list of resources there. And of course, lastly, if you'd like to find out more about FORSA and the campaigns that we work on specifically, or even generally, just, the FORSA website is right there, but any union website usually acts as a great source of information and industrial news if you're interested in that, because like we did in the recent general elections that we had, we sought several commitments from the major political parties on a range of workers' rights issues, and then proceeded to publish all of that and each party's position on the major issues, just as a resource guide before polling day to help inform the people. So just that's also the type of work that's undertaken at FORSA. That's pretty much it for me for this talk, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions or have a chat after this. If you have any questions at all, I'd be more than happy to answer them in the Q&A session scheduled at the end of this webinar. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mehak. Very informative session, very interesting. And I just, I was listening to you, and what you say at the beginning, discrimination begins before actually we are working. So it's just when we are trying to apply for a position, and then we need to face the first few barriers about our surname or accent or nationality or degree. So we are facing barriers even when we are not even working. So it is really important to remember that and to highlight that, So thank you very much for that. Just before we move on, again, remind you that we had the Q&A chat box, and just literally beside that, we have a poll. So we want you to know if you would like to have 5-10 minutes at the end of the session just to share your LinkedIn profile, because we know with this new normal, it's very difficult to do networking and to get to know other people and they are working in our sectors. So if you like, please do the polling, let us know if you want yes or no, and then we will talk at the end about this. So we are moving then to our last speaker before we have the Q&A session. I'm delighted now to give the floor to Liliana Beresani. Lalini. Lalini is the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration in Ireland. Lalini took up her post with IOM Ireland in October 2019 and came from a previous chief mission assignment in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, where she oversaw disaster management, community stabilization, border management, labor migration and integration programs as part of her role. In 2019, Lalini was decorated with the title of Officer of the National Order by the Djiboutian government. Lalini has held numerous roles at various intergovernmental organizations, such as the International Labour Organization and Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and has significant experience in policy and legal consultation, project development, implementation, and evaluation, capacity building and direct assistance, as well as country mission leadership in many international settings: Tunisia, Senegal, Libya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. Her primary focus has been on migration and labor and employment related roles. We are very happy to have you, Lalini. You are very welcome. Again, we cannot clap our hands, but please send your best energy to Lalini.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we can see you. Let me see. Oh, yeah, sorry, yes, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's a very, with all the humility, it's a very warm introduction that you gave. So thank you a lot for that. And if you wouldn't mind managing the presentation, Sandra, is that okay with you? Or would you want me to do that?
Yeah, if you don't mind, because I don't have ready your presentation now. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that's the best view of. Can you see my presentation, all of you?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Not the best view though. I'm just trying to see which view would be the best. Anyhow, I'll move on, and if I find a way to have it on a full screen, I'll do that. But thanks a lot, Sandra, and I'm very pleased to be on that panel today. And good evening to all the attendees and everyone interested to participate in this webinar, including migrant women, migrant in general, but also I see there's a mixed, from what Sandra is telling me, a mix of practitioners, policymakers potentially, and potentially also colleagues from IOM. So thank you again for the invitation. And I think it's good that I'm also talking in the end, because I won't be very specific on the labor rights of migrant women necessarily in the context of Ireland, because first, Natasha touched upon it. And second, I think my role, at least here, would be to maybe give you a sort of a perspective of a more global and regional perspective of the specific issues that migrant women actually face, whether it be in Europe or other continents for that matter, and some trends that we see that actually confirm some of the former panelist also from the trade union was mentioning, and some of the challenges that migrant women face. I think ultimately what Natasha was actually, if I can allow myself to just quickly sum up her presentation, it was basically to showcase on the importance of equal rights between any workers. And that's what all the conventions talk about, is the fact that as long as you're a worker, an employee or a worker, you are entitled to the same rights. And Ireland is a country which actually protects those rights within its legislation and its structures as well, be it from the workplace commissions or other structures that would protect the rights of any worker. So that's very important for any migrant to know that the legislative framework and the institutional framework actually guarantees those rights. In reality, however, and that applies to all countries, perhaps more to others and less to some countries where there are more strong institutions. In reality, the fact that you're also the difference of migrants and their context and their vulnerabilities, or their contract types, or their permit system in a country can lead to perhaps not necessarily a full access in reality of these rights. And this is what we're talking about, I think, and why trade unions, like our speaker before was referring to, is how we can guarantee those rights in reality. Of course, NGOs, NCP, and other NGOs are here to really be closer to migrants and migrant women, to help them understand their rights and try to voice out upon structures, governmental structures. But international organizations also, where they are, and we have the chance in a lot of countries to have the presence of organizations like us, and I'll explain a bit what IOM is, to be here hand in hand with the NGO partners, but also the government, to support in that endeavor towards a better equal structure and equal rights, especially as regards of IOM's mandate. We're talking about migrants. So the International Organization for Migration is, for those who don't know, IOM is the UN migration agency within the UN family. So we're the agency that would look more specifically on the issue of migrant or migration trends, etc. And I put since September 2016, but we don't exist since September 2016. We just gained in 2016 the status of a UN-related agency. We have been set up since 1951, following the World War II, similar to a lot of UN agencies, namely UNHCR and some others. A lot of UN agencies were set up after World War II to really build and strengthen multilateralism and work on specific mandates. This is where we also fit in 1951, and we've grown since then to be officially an intergovernmental organization and part of the UN family. And we've been in Ireland since 2001, so that's almost 20 years next year. And so that's been quite a long time, and I'll explain what we do as well in Ireland all that time. The constitution, and I mean, I'm not going to read the constitution of IOM, but of course there's a whole structure in place with the constitution that really describes what we do and what we're supposed to do with our member states. But it's very clear that our mandate has evolved, but remains a strong support towards supporting member states in the organized transfer of migrants, of refugees, displaced persons as well, but also providing migrant services. And in partnership also, this is something that we don't do alone in most countries. We do it in partnership with the government, with the NGO sector, with the private sector. And that relates to the issue of labor migration, to integration, to medical assessments, and so forth. And in that same mandate, we do provide policy advice. And this is a growing field for IOM, where we have developed so much experience and policy experience that we are better positioned, we think, to provide this policy advice and best practice advice, as well as a lot of UN agencies do. You might know the voluntary return program in Ireland. It's not just a program for Ireland. It's a big program, a global program, which is customized in each country based on the needs, based on the realities. And it's a program which offers the possibility of a migrant, a vulnerable migrant to want to return home, because that's a right also to want to be able to return back home and decide to make a new life back home. And this is really in line with trying to encourage states to go through that avenue and reduce the forced return that we call deportations oftentimes, and really try to encourage a more dignified and humane return of a migrant, of any migrant. And of course, another mandate that we have is to promote this forum of and platform for states to exchange views and experience. So we have a lot of these consultative processes or mechanisms, bilateral and multilateral, where we promote exchange of ideas, of experience in the context of Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia, and I can give a few examples if that's of an interest to the attendees. We have up to now 173 member states. Ireland is a member state, of course, and 8 states that haven't joined IOM yet, but are still on as observers, as well as a list of international organizations and regional organizations, as long as NGOs that are observers to the IOM. For Ireland, it might be relevant because I know some of them have either links or are based here. The Jesuit Refugee Services, which is a more global network, is an observer to IOM, Amnesty International, the Intercatholic Migration Center as well, the International Organization for Employees, the Trade Union Confederation, which the confederations from here would be part of the ITUC, the bigger ones. And I mentioned the Mary Robinson Foundation because Mary Robinson, of course, is from here, but there's a long list of NGOs that are observers to IOM. I wanted to go through some concepts and some figures and trends global, and then I'll come back to Ireland trends and figures and at least some of the initial assessments that I've done, because Sandra also mentioned that I've just arrived in Ireland. It's only been 6 months, so I'm still discovering the context here. Of course, comparing with what I've seen and the trends and best or not as good practices in other spaces. So it's interesting to compare. But I'll share some of the trends with you because I think it's important to put things into perspective. If you talk about a migrant worker or labor migration, of course we know the definition, but there's no definition, but a broad definition, a working definition that we've come up with is someone moving to another country, which is not her or his home state, to another state for a purpose of employment. So employment is actually the key thing. Now, someone who's moving, it's not necessarily for employment, it's not necessarily linked to whether it's a regular or irregular. We don't look at that. It's irrespective of resident status. If someone within the EU has free movement of circulation, residence and work, this is a migrant worker. If someone coming from another country, another region outside the EU, this is also someone coming without papers or overstaying, this is still considered as a migrant worker. And I think it's important, and we'll look at the different categories because that's also linked with potential vulnerabilities and potential risks and abuse and exploitation that one could face in addition to being a woman. The overall data that we have, and again, data is in the past, but data is what we have right now, is that out of the 7.8 billion people that we are all on this planet, it is estimated that 1 billion are migrants. 1 billion meaning it's not all the 1 billion that are international migrants and moving from one country to the other. It's actually just 272 million that are international migrants. And it looks a big number, of course, but it equals to 3.5% of the world population. That's the formal figures that we have, of course, because I think it's maybe a little bit bigger, but it's still not an extensive size where we would think, oh, because we're hearing so much about the movements in the Mediterranean and so forth, it's a big percentage. It's actually 3.5% of world population. And out of that number, 48% are actually women. 48% are women, but if you look at the women that are working within the working age population of 20 to 64 years old, it's actually 42% of women who are migrant workers and women. Why I'm actually insisting a lot on that 40-ish% is that it's pretty much at par, that men migrate as much as women. And there's a concept which we call feminization of migration more and more, because when we say 40 or 50% of migrants are women, women are actually, female migrants or women are actually moving alone as the main source of income, as the main responsible of the household. This has changed over time, because you would see women maybe accompanying more her spouse in the past, but this concept of feminization of migration, of a woman going alone to work, makes things completely different. And this is where I think we should be more cognizant of these gender targeted policies to put in place to ensure that there's proper labor market inclusion, there's proper protection towards specific vulnerabilities that women would face as a woman. And I put a figure, I think, because I think it's important to mention that is the international remittance, is the transfer of money that is sent from a migrant back home. In 2018, the World Bank was estimating that at 689 billion USD. And I mentioned that because we'll talk about what's happening during COVID right after. I was quite fortunate to get a few statistics from CSO on the some of the trends of migrant women in Ireland. And I think it's interesting to really see the evolution, the progress over 10 years, or a bit less than 10 years in some of the cases, depending on the data I got. But if you look at 2013 and 2019 from CSO, that's quite an interesting number of the EU13, EU13 being the new EU member states since 2004. So in orange for 2019, you'd see the highest number of migrant women actually come from that region. And then the second biggest population would be what we call the rest of the world, or the other nationalities, sometimes with the statistics. But that's quite an important figure. The total figure is, in 2019 at least, was 310,800. That's actually 50%, 49.9, 50% of the migrant population calculated by CSO is actually migrant women. So it also links up with what we're seeing at global level, that it's pretty much at par with male migrants or men migrating. If you look now at the different sectors, I didn't put all the sectors, but if you also compare 10 years ago, a bit less than 10 years, and now, on the non-Irish, and I say documented because these are data that we're getting from, of course, from CSO and from employment permits and so forth. So these are documented migrant workers. And you see the different sectors where there are more migrant workers, or how it's doubled in time, or sometimes just increased in time. But if you look at human health and social work, which is all the health workers, the persons, the carers, the cleaners, the key workers during COVID, you see the numbers, it's quite a high number in 2019, and it's actually doubled in 10 years. The numbers in the accommodation food service also has remained pretty much the same, but it's a strong number, along with the wholesale and retail sector. The IT sector has doubled. Again, this data is not just for migrant women, it's for migrant women and men, it's migrants in general, non-Irish workers. But you see those trends, and we'll maybe go a bit more in details in the next few slides, and maybe understanding some of the trends among migrant women. Now, the employment permits, we didn't really segregate by type of employment permits because we know the different types of employment permits. But if you look at the data from last year, you see interesting trends of the nationalities that need employment permits to be working here. So there's one thing of having labor rights and meeting all the expectations under employment acts in a country, but there's also another part of your status as a foreign worker to having to meet also rights in terms of residence and permit to be able to work. So if you look at that number and those trends, India comes quite importantly in the list. I think the total was around 16,000. I don't have the number right now, but I think it was 16,400. But India is the highest, Philippines, Brazil, the US, Pakistan, and South Africa, and Ukraine. So it's and China, of course. So as I said, it's a combination of different types of permits, but it's an interesting trend to look at. Now, I only got data from 2018 on the sectors where migrant women actually work in. But if you look and you compare with the slide, the previous slide, and if you look at the different color codes, so blue would be the total of non-Irish, orange would be migrant women, and gray is actually the color for other nationalities, so non-EU who actually need a permit to come in and may potentially face some additional vulnerabilities for a number of reasons. And if you look at, again, those trends, it's interesting because a lot of migrant women work in the human health and social work sector. A lot of migrant women work in the accommodation and food services and wholesale and retail, along with the administrative and support services. These, for me, are the main trends. And if you look at nationalities, those who are from non-EU, again, in gray, you see that a lot of actually these migrant women would come from non-EU countries with, again, potentially more vulnerabilities, not necessarily, but potentially. Again, I don't want it to be a course, but I think it's important to remember that the different types of migrant workers, different types of mobility. We all know that depending on your category, sometimes you're more at risk. If you're low to a semi-skilled worker, you're definitely more at risk for a number of reasons than a highly skilled who maybe earns more or have access to more incentives and so forth. You would be more at risk also if you were in a documented or undocumented, which we call legal or irregular, if you're coming as a student and you're working part-time. All this relates also to your potential access to some rights. The former speaker was talking, Natasha, I think, was talking about the COVID unemployment payment. Although the system is very inclusive in theory, you would realize that depending on your status, it might be more difficult to access this right sometimes because you might need to show some papers, your contracts. If you're in the informal sector and undocumented, you might not have all these documents. Or if you're a temporary worker and so forth, you might not necessarily adhere to all the different rights, labor rights. What has been the impact that we've seen actually up to now? Because we're actually still in that current hurricane. So it's difficult to really understand the trends and the impact, but at least from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, there's a report that came out and said that out of actually the 3 billion workers worldwide, at the time of the peak of COVID, 81% of the labor force was affected. 60% work in the informal sector. This does not necessarily apply to here, but obviously if you're non-documented, you're not captured as definitely in the system, and you may fall into that informal sector. Which are the main sectors of employment that are affected? Naturally, and that actually applies, I've seen, to most countries or region. It's actually the arts, entertainment, transport, accommodation and food, real estate, wholesale, retail, And these are the sectors where there's a high concentration of migrant workers. And if you go back, remember the statistics, a high concentration of migrant women. So who would be affected the most? Of course, workers in general, but in these sectors, we see that not just here, in most countries, migrant workers would actually be affected. And I'll come back to that because the trends also that we've seen during crisis, being SARS or the bird flu or the financial crisis, we'll see some trends that came up that affected perhaps more migrant workers than nationals and then locally born workers. Just take the wholesale sector, for example. Sorry, I see there's a poll that came up. Just look at the wholesale retail and the numbers that show how many people have been affected. If you look at the fashion industry, which is an industry of up to $2.5 trillion, it's estimated that 80% of that industry will be affected, especially in Europe and in North America. And that links up with the whole chain of production, as we know, because a lot of these productions are outsourced or offshored to other countries. So the impact will be, I think, important. If you look at the last number and data that I gave you is relates to that very specific sector of health and social work and carers and cleaners, the key workers. And 70% of these jobs, which is estimated 136 million workers working in that sector, are actually held by women. This is probably the case here too. And as it is in Europe in general, because I was reading a recent report from the EU saying that 13% of the key workers right now during COVID are actually immigrants. And that 13% is within the 31% of all workers in the EU that are actually working in key sectors. Key sectors meaning the teaching, the skilled agricultural workers, science, personal care workers and cleaners, and of course the health professionals. What are the impact, and these are my two last slides, what are the impacts on migrant women potentially, in addition to all these vulnerabilities that we can see on labor rights, because this is more about labor rights today. I think the impact will be visible once we really start we go in that reboosting phase, and we are actually in it right now, and we see how efficient it is. Regardless of that, I think it was seen in the 2008 financial crisis, it was seen in other more bigger pandemics, it will impact naturally the economy. And this is a trend that we see, obviously, there will be a focus on nationals first. And this is a trend we've seen. The World Bank has issued a few figures where you see the increased unemployment more amongst migrants than nationals. I can give you an example of the 2008 financial crisis. Unemployment in the EU in 2009 was 11.1% for native born and 16.4% for migrant workers. So obviously, I think the trend will be, hopefully not, but this is a trend that we're seeing. And if we want to use some of the former trends, this is something that we may be seeing as well, where migrant workers are more easily laid off or not re-employed than, of course, the nationals with more, potentially more, I mean, not potentially, but more rights in addition to labor rights. The impact will differ on the migrant category, obviously, and the vulnerability. If you're a documented migrant, of course, all the rights that were laid out previously might be more easily accessible. But if you're in a more informal sector with more, or job security is not very secured because it's a temporary contract, or you're undocumented, of course, you will face more, a stronger impact on your employment or your future in that specific country. I think we need to realize also, and that was very clearly spelled out in this pandemic, is the contribution of migrants, but also migrant women. Because again, coming back to that ratio of number of women working, migrant women working in that sector of the health, I think we wouldn't have been able to make it if we didn't have as many Filipino carers or Indian workers or other nationalities working in that sector. especially the health sector. So I think we need to recognize the contribution, we meaning policymakers, countries, everyone needs to realize that and change a bit our mindset on the inclusion and the contribution that migration and migrants actually bring to a country. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, there will be a decrease in remittances, and that will impact, I think, a lot of countries, especially the remittances that are being sent by migrant women. Migrant women are known to be sending more money back home because they have this stronger responsibility to have to send back money to their children or extended family. So it's actually going to impact more migrant women, I think, than anyone else. We know that migrant women or women in general are more exposed to violence, to abuse, to cases of smuggling and trafficking, and it's not going to stop. It didn't stop during the COVID. We saw movements of boats coming in Malta, the Canary Islands, and so forth. It's not going to stop. And the trends actually in the past show us that it increases during crisis periods. So one needs to really make sure that we are all of us, we know the signs, we do recognize what are potential cases of people that have been smuggled or trafficked or exploited, or cases of victims of migrant women, victims of violence and domestic violence. This is something that we know has increased generally in a lot of countries, including here, and will affect naturally migrant women as well. The former speakers talked about job concentration and segregation in some position. I think that's very key because, and I was reading a study. I didn't see a lot of studies available here on migrant women, fortunately, but I saw a study that was done by the Human Rights Commission in 2005. And the I Took strategy as well talked about it, is the issue of women not moving up in the organization, in the business, or remaining at a certain, or women maintaining that position because it's known to be a more women-led position. This is something that we need to change over time, because we're wasting a bit the skills of women. 48% of women in Europe are overskilled for the position, or migrant women are overskilled for the position they're doing. So I think we really need to think about that aspect of, that doesn't come from me, that comes from the head of UN Women, about including women in decision-making positions. And of course, the impact will be, and that was discussed previously, is increased discrimination, misreporting, misjudgment on migrants. We've already seen in a lot of countries that migrants are being used as scapegoats, are being seen as the super spreaders of the pandemic, and that will impact on their work inclusion, just their social integration in society in general. So basically, what I wanted to say is, I think there's something that we need to recognize here is the importance of labor migrants in those key sectors, as I said. I think labor mobility will not stop. It's been known today in the 21st century as one of the main disruptive changes, along with technology and some other disruptive changes, is the demography, the aging population. Labor mobility will not stop. It will remain a reality. It will probably increase with all the different factors that are in place. So we need to take into account that into our strategies, whether it's undocumented, documented. And I'm quite glad that in the new government program, I see a few mentions of regularizations of undocumented migrants. That increases their rights and their inclusion into society here, especially for those who've been here for a long time. And I won't go back on the issue of anti-migrant discourses. I think this is very important. The more we have data and evidence, it really shows that there's more contribution than anything else of migrant women. And focus as much as possible on, yes, the equal rights are there, but let's really think on what the reality is on their potential risk, migrant women, of staying into low income positions, the brain waste of these women, maybe the weak social protection in some cases, their low ability of savings because of so many reasons, and violence and abuse towards them increasingly. So I'll stop there, and I'll be very happy to take any questions if there's any. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lalini. Thank you very much. It was really interesting and important to kind of see the broad perspective of the impact on labor migration and migrant women in Ireland and in the rest of the world. So thank you very much. So I don't want to speak too much because we are getting a few questions and we would like to answer them. So if I can ask all the speakers, all the panelists to switch on their camera, please. That's lovely. So we can see each other now and we can see everyone. So I'm gonna, because I'm conscious about the time, so we have approximately 5-10 minutes maximum, no more than that. So I'm gonna pick 2 different questions. And then if somebody wants to get in contact with us and for anything else, we will be very pleased to answer any question or anything that you want from us. So the first question, I'm gonna say the 2 of them and then you can choose which one you want to answer or who want to answer that. So the first one is what work is being done and by which organization to better understand our work on reducing unconscious bias amongst hiring managers. So that's the first one. And the second one, what is your take on the enforcement of the right to equality and non-discrimination by nationalities when it comes to job search? In my experience, it has been really difficult to even get to interviews since many employers in Ireland are looking for EU candidates or stamp 4 holders only. I presume due to the long time that take processing work permits that is currently take up to 14 weeks. Anyone wants to answer these 2 questions?
I'm happy to answer the question about organizations working on reducing unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Well, there are different organizations and even individuals working on reducing the unconscious bias among hire managers in Ireland. And I'll just name a couple. For example, our Open Doors initiative is a project that is very similar to my work project, and they are working towards the rights of refugees and asylum seekers and people with disabilities to find employment in Ireland. And they work with organizations and companies to reduce unconscious bias and to diversify their organization. Adaku Eseudo, she is an individual and she is actually a diversity and inclusion consultant, and she works directly with companies to try to work on the reducing unconscious bias and diversify their companies. And of course, as part of our program in MyWell, one of the trainings we are offering is aimed at companies or organizations directed at HR staff and people involved in the hiring processes of an organization, so that we can build bridges together to overcome the barriers that migrant women and migrant descendant women face in accessing employment in Ireland. And one of the barriers that we have identified is unconscious bias, because as the name implies, sometimes it's unconscious and people don't know that they're actually being biased against specific groups. So there is work being done. More work probably would be better, but surely, slowly but surely, we are working towards this. And the more people are aware of the situation, and the more people, like even talking to people that you know about unconscious bias would be beneficial, because it is unconscious and not everyone knows that they have it. We may even have it ourselves. So yeah, keep in mind Open Doors initiative, Adaku Eseudo, and the MyWell project. We're working on reducing unconscious bias for hiring managers.
Thank you very much. And someone, Mehak or Lalini,
Yeah,
you want to answer the second one maybe, or you want to say something?
Of course, yeah. Just on the issue of looking for EU candidates and having trouble accessing interviews, something, like I said before, if it's a legal requirement of having wanting EU candidates, due to travel restrictions or the nature of the job that's being advertised, that's okay. That's a genuine reason for asking for that. but you can absolutely question why that's being stated on the job application and what is the purpose of having that on there. Because if it's a genuine legal requirement, that's okay. But if it's not, then it is discriminatory. Like the person mentioned, it acts as a barrier to accessing employment. And you can raise that issue with a local rep again, or but my advice would be, firstly, question why it's on there. Absolutely question what's the reason for putting it on there, because that just helps bring about a change, you know, the systemic change that's really required. So that would just be my advice on it.
Thank you. Sorry.
I can add, I think, I mean, Mehak and Sandra would be the best in place to respond to those very more maybe concrete questions. And I do agree with Mehak is that if you do not ask why, then you won't know, and you will keep that perception that you were maybe it was a discriminatory decision and so forth. And there might be genuine reasons why you were not. There might not be, but if you have to confront the business to say, well, can I understand why I wasn't recruited and what happened, and give me feedback. Now, that's one thing. I think it's important when I was looking at, and that's maybe more of a policy person talking from my end, more of maybe a practitioner working with those issues. But when I was looking at studies, I didn't find quite a lot of studies on that. I did find one, and when I went into the sampling, I realized it was still a small sample. So I think there's a lot to do on that aspect, just to come up with maybe more understanding and trends of what's happening. Is it something which is recurrent? Is it maybe just one or two cases and it's more of a performance issue and or language issue and so forth? Or is it discrimination? I think we need to come with evidence-based to be able to come out with and saying, well, yes, it is, no, it's not. So I think there's more to do, and would be more than happy, and I've been saying that a few times, either at government level, but with NCP and so forth. I think just more data, more evidence would be really needed to really come out with some trends.
That's lovely. Thank you very much for your answers. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, but again, if somebody wants to get in contact with us, our email is mywow, MIWOW, @newcommunity.ie. So you can get in contact with us, and we will be very pleased to answer any question. So I just want to thank you again, everyone who was here tonight and who was able to join today to this panel. Especially thank you to Lalini, to Natasha, to Mehak. Of course, thank you very much to our interpreters, and they are here today doing a very hard work, as well as our administrator, Diego. And I cannot leave without saying to our funders and NCP for giving us the opportunity to have this panel. And also, just to mention, you know, that there are older partners out there, that they are every day fighting and striving for the rights of migrant women and to find a more fair and equal treatment and social justice for us, such as Stamp 3 campaign, Black Lives Matter, Protect Accent campaign. So just to say that we are here shoulder to shoulder and we are together on this. That's it from today. Follow us to keep an eye on our next webinar. That is going to be about effective networking to land in your industry. And it's going to happen, it will happen at the end of July. And yes, sorry, about the poll, well, no, unfortunately, it's quite funny because it's quite tight. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave it for the next webinar. But if you'd like to connect with myself, I will be very happy to hear from you. That's all for tonight. Good evening, stay safe, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.